Hello and welcome back. Now, I don't always disagree with world's utmost authority on effective and honest data visualizations, but when I do, it's with the Kellogg School of Management professor, Steve Franconeri. Now, I obviously say these things in zest. However, Stephen Franconeri did write an article, or rather, this article was written based on research and insights of Stephen Franconeri, and I will link the article in the description of this video. I've read the article, good article. I recommend that you guys familiarize yourself with his opinion. I do, however, have a couple of points of criticism, and this is what I'm going to cover in this video. Now, before I jump into the criticism, take a look at this graphics here. I think it's genius. You have an angel drawing a line, you have a devil with an eraser trying to hide some data. This painting is done by Evgeny Neiberg, and I think it's brilliant. Now, as you can see from the title of this article covers 4 keys to effective and honest data visualizations. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Basically, if you look into this, some of the advice is around truncating your y-axis and trying to figure out the right scale of y-axis. If you have read any articles or watched any videos on ethics and honesty of your visualizations, you will see that this is usually the topic number 1 that gets covered, so I'm not going to get too much into it. Number 2 is talking about the context for your visuals. Number 3 talks about different people, different lenses, so basically how people with different perspectives might see the same data differently. And then the last point is to avoid the curse of knowledge. Basically talks about how once you see a pattern, your brain cannot unsee it. So you might see things one way, and people who have not recognized the pattern may completely not understand what it is that you're talking about and not see the same thing that are very clear to you. Now, what is my biggest beef with this article? My biggest beef here is related to these two charts. So here in the article, Stephen says the following. He's trying to compare the average world temperature in these two charts. The chart on the left shows the world temperature in Fahrenheit, and you can see the scale of the chart is from 0 to 100, and the time scales go from 1850 to year 2000 and beyond. And then on the right chart, we see the same data. However, now our scale has changed in the y-axis. So where before it went from 0 to 100, now it goes from 56 to 59 degrees. Covers the same period, and now where before, if you just look at the same data in Fahrenheit, you see almost no change in global temperature. In the right chart, you see a dramatic spike happening from year, let's say 1975, all the way to recent times. So let me read something from his article. From some problems, it might be misleading not to truncate the y-axis. So this truncation, not truncation, you could see in chart 1. In a controversial climate change chart tweeted out by National Review, the trend of a warming climate was obscured by starting the y-axis at 0 Fahrenheit here. Here, the 0 baseline hides the important pattern so strongly that it might be considered dishonest. That visual does not match the honest argument, since a relatively tiny change in temperature can mean a foot of water in someone's property in Florida, Franconeri says. Most designers would consider the version at the right, which is more similar to the choice for stock chart, is the honest depiction of the data. Now let's talk about this a little bit. Which chart is honest and which chart is dishonest? It's showing exactly the same data. Therefore, I would argue that both charts are equally honest or dishonest. All we are doing with either chart 1 or chart 2 is playing to our own confirmation bias. I argue that the chart in and of itself, neither left one nor the right one, is any more honest. The problem is that each of this chart is a reflection of the initial intent of the author to manipulate or impact a particular point of view. Now, why do I think that both of them are dishonest? Well, let's take a look at how I define what visualization is ethical and what visualization is not ethical. In one of my prior videos, when I talked about data persuasion, I stated the following. Ethics of data is not related to the quality of data or persuasion objective. So whether you believe that global warming exists, or whether you believe that global warming does not exist, your intent and your data to back up that objective is not unethical. So what makes it unethical? Well, these are the musts of data ethics. And as we go through this, you will see why those two charts, both of them are unethical. Number 1, data must not rely on metrics with misleading or contextual definitions. Now, both of those charts all show the same data, which is a global mean temperature. Number 2, so they don't violate the first bullet point. Number 2, must not withhold insight that conflicts with or contradicts with the persuasion objective. Now, clearly, both of those charts do not meet the requirements for point number 2, and I'll give you the example for this a little later. Number 3, must not have adequate levels of details and scale. Obviously, this is where I agree with Steven, because the first chart definitely does not have an adequate level of details and scale. Number 4, must provide relevant time range and context. I argue both of those charts fail to meet that criteria. They're both misleading. And lastly, must compare local and global contexts when possible. So let me take a look at the second chart and show you why the second chart does not meet all of the criteria that I outline in the presentation. Here's by the way, pay attention please how dramatic this rise of the temperature appears on this chart versus when we look at the same chart here and we see that growth in temperature does not appear all that dramatic. And why does it not appear quite that dramatic is because we extended our y-axis, the scale of it, so that angle now has changed. So that's another way how you can make your chart quote-unquote more persuasive, is by just widening or narrowing the y or x axis, and then you could see how a dramatic spike in this chart looks a lot less dramatic in this chart, even though they appear to show exactly the same data. So why do I think this is dishonest? It's dishonest because when you're talking to the audience that's critical of this chart, they already have certain expectations and certain biases and confirmation biases that if you were to have an effective argument, you have to meet and explain and debunk. So if I were to talk to somebody who does not believe in global warming, they might say, well, here you go. Here's the growth of temperature from 1900 to 1950. There's no CO2 in the atmosphere. How do you explain this? What happened before 1900, right? So if I were to make an effective argument that global temperatures are rising, I cannot just show one chart and be convincing. I can convince somebody for 15 minutes, but then somebody will go do an easy Google search and find a lot of different points of view. You'd not want your audience to find those different points of view when you're not there to help them with your argument or support your argument. You want to show all of the arguments against your arguments and then show your position for why your argument is better. By you hiding all of the oppositions and different views, you're just going to polarize your audience. You may get them for a short period of time, and then your credibility with your audience over time will shrink. So I did a quick Google search on, okay, what would happen if I try to show a longer time period? So if I were to look for 10,000 years, you can see that what's happening right now, we're actually much lower in terms of temperature than we were over the last 10,000 years. Again, I'm not a climatologist. I don't know what's going on. All I'm trying to tell you is that when you're talking to the audience that does not believe in what you're trying to sell them, you have to show all of the other materials that they may find in about an hour or 2 minutes, Google on the internet. So if you do not come back with all of the same data that they will find anyway, and if you don't explain your point of view using the contradictory theory, then your argument is not going to be very honest and very persuasive, and your credibility will suffer. Here's the sea level for what's happening in Florida. Steven says that a small fluctuation in temperature will lead a foot of water in somebody's basement. Well, again, very quick search on what's happening with the sea level in Florida tells us that on average sea level trend is rising by 2.15 millimeters a year, and that has been consistent since 1900. So again, if I were to do an honest argument for or against global warming, all of these charts have to be present, and I have to be able to explain everything. I have to talk about this is why I think temperatures are rising, this is why I may not see the rise in sea levels yet, and this is how I can explain what happened over the last 10,000 years, over the last 1,000 years. So all of that information has to be presented to a skeptic audience, and only then are you being honest, because your intention is to be honest. Your intention is not to influence. Your intention is not to just persuade. Your intention is to show all the for and against arguments, and then to show that your arguments are actually better than those of your opposition. So both of these charts belong in politics. They belong in a conversation that's meant to divide us. And if you are talking to your colleagues, if you're talking to your customers, then having a conversation showing charts like this will never be successful. Yes, you might be able to get to persuade them for 15 minutes, half an hour to an hour during your call or your meeting, your presentation, but after you go, they will go and validate their assumptions with their colleagues. They're going to do some research on the internet. All of this other stuff will come up and you're going to look like a fool. Please don't do that. Let me know what you think about my position. Do you think I'm making sense? Do you think I'm being overly dramatic? I believe you need to treat your colleagues and your audience with respect, but maybe I'm being too naive and altruistic. Maybe you do, in some cases, have to go in and just think about how persuasive you might be, regardless of honesty. And maybe some topics and some objectives are worth that sort of approach. Hope you enjoy this video, and I'm looking forward to see you back soon. Bye.